Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open the dusty doors of the Vatican. Just, 1,000 years ago. The candles are flickering. The incense is thick. And somewhere in a Roman palace, a pope is sneaking a lover out the back stairs while bribing a noble family with a bishop's robe. Because tonight, we're diving into the world of medieval popes. And let me tell you, it's less Holy Father, more House of the Dragon, but with mitres. You're wandering through a marble corridor, torchlight bouncing off walls covered in ancient frescoes of saints doing good deeds. That's the public face. Behind the curtain, it's a political cage match, and the papacy, the literal throne of St. Peter, is the prize. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Middle Ages was not a time of spiritual tranquility in Rome. No, it was a messy, simmering soup of family feuds, political backstabbing, and more than a few casual murders. Perfect bedtime material, really. The papacy was technically a religious office, yes, but that didn't stop ambitious, noble families from treating it like a seasonal prize in a Game of Thrones. Imagine if the CEO of your company was chosen by whoever had the sharpest dagger and the loudest choir. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Holy See was a prized possession of the Roman aristocracy. Papal elections were less about divine inspiration and more about muscle, money, and marrying off your niece to the right man. One family in particular, the powerful Theophylacts, basically ran the papacy like a franchise. If you wanted to be pope, you had to kiss their rings, or their feet, or maybe both. Theodora and her daughter Marozia were particularly infamous. Historians still argue whether they were cunning political masterminds or just the only competent people in a city full of power-hungry dolts. Either way, they managed to install popes like chess pieces, often ones they were related to or romantically involved with, or both, depending on the rumor mill. You stroll through the Lateran Palace and catch the scent of roasted meats, maybe some wine sloshing in golden goblets. Sounds like a feast. But it's not Easter. It's just Tuesday. This wasn't a holy man's court. This was a place where spiritual robes brushed against blood-stained daggers, where prayers were whispered right before bribes were handed over. One pope even held banquets in his palace that made Roman emperors blush. Lots of wine, little clothing, and almost no scripture. This period got so messy that historians had to give it a name: the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the Papacy, not because it lacked documentation, but because people would prefer not to talk about it at all. Honestly, calling it a rough patch would be like describing a volcano as a bit of a hot mess. You hear the rustle of velvet robes. A cardinal passes by, glaring. He's probably sizing you up to see if you're useful or disposable. Welcome to the era when sainthood was optional, but ambition was not. And yet, beneath the chaos, you glimpse something stranger still. Faith, clinging on. Despite the corruption, people still lined up to see the Pope. Pilgrims still flocked to Rome. The Church still carried weight, even if it was occasionally stuffed into a money pouch and flung onto a horse. It's a paradox. A pope could be scheming behind closed doors and then walk into a basilica the next morning and deliver a rousing sermon on humility. The people wanted spiritual leadership. The families wanted land and power. The Church had to be both heaven and headquarters. Somewhere, a bell tolls, not for Mass, not for prayer. It's the sound of a deal being struck, a title being traded, another nephew being installed as bishop of somewhere he's never even heard of. Nepotism was not a bug. It was the system. But the irony? The same system that corrupted the papacy also kept it alive. These families protected it, invested in it, made it visible. Without them, Rome might have been taken by someone else entirely. Maybe a king. Maybe a rival sect. Maybe a particularly enthusiastic goat farmer with a sword. Still, you're starting to feel it, aren't you? That creeping sense that holiness is getting hard to define here. That perhaps the divine got tangled up in too many legal scrolls and wine-stained banquets. But buckle up, because if you think this was messy, just wait until you meet John XII. You hear music, soft at first, then rowdy. It's coming from inside the Lateran Palace. Laughter, crashing goblets, and what sounds like a goat bleating in protest. You step closer. This isn't just a banquet. This is a party thrown by a pope. Not just any pope, either. This is John XII. and he's just 19 years old. That's right. 19. You, too, can become Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church, as long as your dad is a powerful Roman noble who treats the papacy like a birthday present, which is essentially what happened. John XII, born Octavianus, was the son of Alberic II of Spoleto, the de facto ruler of Rome at the time. And when Daddy died, he strongly encouraged everyone to vote for his teenage son as Pope. Spoiler alert, they did. Now, being a pope during this era was never easy. But being a pope who has the impulsiveness of a teenager, access to enormous wealth, and literally no one to say no, that's how you get John XII. He wasn't subtle about it either. The Vatican, under his reign, morphed into something more like a Roman frat house than a center of Christian virtue. Historians still argue whether he genuinely believed in God or just thought the Holy Spirit sounded cool in Latin. You step into his chambers, half expecting scripture. Instead, you find dice scattered on the floor, bottles of wine stacked like kindling, and a woman, not a nun, let's just say, lounging on a silk-draped couch. You've got a front row seat to what many later chroniclers would call one of the most scandalous papacies in history. And considering the competition, that's saying something. John XII wasn't content with just being Pope. He treated the role like a crown from Burger King. He handed out church offices like party favors. Want to be bishop of somewhere? Cool. Bring wine. Want to be a cardinal? Make sure you flatter his horse. No, literally. There are claims he ordained a deacon in a horse stable, possibly while drunk. And then there were the rumors. The whispers of his escapades filled the alleys of Rome, gambling, mistresses, affairs with both men and women, a love of falconry that may or may not have involved letting birds loose in the basilica. At one point, an imperial envoy accused him of invoking pagan gods during dinner. One story says he toasted the devil. Whether true or not, you begin to suspect this pope might not be canonized anytime soon. But of course, Rome being Rome, it took a while before people did anything. After all, as long as the church was still functioning, baptisms performed, marriages blessed, relics kissed, who cared if the Pope was rolling dice in the crypt? Well, one person did care. Emperor Otto Versus. He had crowned John XII, hoping for a loyal spiritual ally. What he got was a wine-stained disaster in a robe. So in a very unholy showdown, Otto marched into Rome and summoned a synod to depose the Pope. That's right. The emperor tried to fire the Pope. And here's the best part. John XII ran away, just vanished into the countryside, leaving behind chaos, mistresses, and probably some unpaid tavern bills. For a brief moment, Rome had a new pope, one who actually read the Bible. But John wasn't done. Oh no. He returned, rallied support, and took back the papacy by force. Imagine the office drama. But like all badly behaved teen idols, his reign ended suddenly and stupidly. One chronicle claims he was caught in bed with a married woman and beaten to death by her husband. Others suggest he died of a stroke during particularly enthusiastic nighttime activities. Scholars can't agree. Historians still argue whether he was murdered, cursed, or simply partied himself into the grave. Either way, he died at 24. He'd spent 5 years as Pope, and probably at least half of that blackout drunk. Now, you sit quietly in a corner of the palace, looking around at the velvet curtains and broken chalices. There's no denying it. This was a man who treated sanctity like a prank, and yet the Church survived. People still prayed, still believed. Maybe they were used to the chaos by now. Because if John XII taught the world anything, it's that power without boundaries makes for some very strange bedtime stories. And this was just the warm-up. He wasn't the only pope who forgot which commandments he was supposed to follow. Just wait until you meet the guy who literally sold the papacy like a used chariot. You wander deeper into the echoing halls of the Vatican, though Vatican might be a generous term for the place at this point. There's spilled wine in the corner, a forgotten sandal, a very confused-looking donkey tied to a bishop's chair. You're not in a spiritual sanctuary. You're in the final stages of John XII's legacy. And oh boy, does it get worse before it gets holy. Welcome to the extended after-party of one of the most chaotic popes in history. You thought a teenage pope was wild? Try staying for dessert, because it's time to explore the truly surreal scandals of John XII, the ones that make seasoned historians rub their temples and mutter, maybe we just skip this chapter. Imagine waking up one morning in 10th century Rome to find that your supreme pontiff, God's representative on earth, is throwing dice with local thugs in a smoky back room. Pope John XII didn't just roll dice, he gambled constantly. The Lateran Palace wasn't so much a seat of divine inspiration as it was a dice den, with a few crucifixes scattered for decoration. And not just that, he was rumored to bless the dice before throwing them. Superstition and sanctity stirred with wine. The gambling wasn't even the worst part. John surrounded himself with mistresses, some of whom moved in with him, turning his papal residence into what later chroniclers called a brothel. That word shows up a lot in records from this time. It's almost like scribes gave up trying to be poetic and just wrote, "There were women everywhere, and most of them weren't here for Mass." And then there were the feasts. Ah yes, the legendary feasts of Pope John. These weren't your humble, pious gatherings over bread and wine. These were marathon banquets with roasted peacocks, buckets of imported wine, pagan music, and guests so sketchy they'd make Nero look like a Sunday school teacher. One chronicler alleges he raised toasts to pagan gods and even made mock offerings to Satan during a drunken bender. Did he really? Historians still argue whether this happened or whether it was a smear campaign by his enemies. But either way, the rumor stuck. Once you get nicknamed the Devil's Pope, it tends to cling. You stroll into what used to be the chapel, now thick with smoke and perfume. A deacon slurs his way through a blessing. Another is asleep in the pew. According to some accounts, John ordained a man as bishop in a horse stable, because apparently the pulpit was double booked with a wine tasting. That's not a joke. It might have been a Thursday. And while it's tempting to laugh, and you should gently, it's good for the soul, the deeper truth is stranger. The Church was cracking under pressure. The papacy was at the center of a swirl of wealth, land grabs, family feuds, and imperial politics. Popes weren't chosen for holiness. They were chosen for usefulness. John just took the corruption and made it flamboyant. In fact, he ruled less like a pope and more like a petty king, drunk on authority and actual alcohol. And when he wasn't throwing parties, he was threatening bishops, excommunicating enemies on a whim, and taking vengeance on anyone who dared criticize him. One bishop who tried to correct him ended up having his nose and tongue cut out. Subtlety was not his style, and yet, in the middle of this chaos, the machinery of the Church kept chugging along. Baptisms were performed. Mass was held. poor pilgrims still wandered into Rome, hoping for a blessing. It's as if the faith was a great stone wheel, too massive to stop, even if the driver was passed out behind the altar. There's a funny sort of resilience here. The people clung to their beliefs, even when their leader was scandal incarnate. Maybe they didn't expect perfection. Maybe they just figured that God could work through even the most ludicrous mess. And John XII? He may have been exiled, dethroned, returned, and finally killed in what might have been a jealous husband's revenge. But the stories of his misdeeds echoed long after his body was buried. Whispered through the centuries, they painted a picture of a man who mistook power for permission, and who found out, far too late, that even the papacy has limits. You step away from the candlelit chaos, trailing the scent of wine and incense toward another wing of the palace. A name drifts through the air. Benedict IX. You hear murmurs about a pope who sold his office, gave it up, took it back, and made everyone around him dizzy from the drama. If you thought John XII was a spiritual train wreck, you're about to meet the guy who turned being pope into a recurring internship. You pass through a hallway lined with cracked frescoes, each one depicting popes with solemn faces and golden halos. But somewhere between the saintly expressions, you start to notice the eyes, shifty, maybe a little smug. And then you reach the door marked Benedictus IX, and you know you're in for something special. Not saintly, just special. Benedict XIX. The man, the myth, the 3-time Pope. Yes, you heard that right. He was Pope, not once, not twice, but 3 times. At this point, you're wondering if the papacy was just something people picked up on weekends. But no, this was real. And if John XII was the Church's teenage wild child, Benedict IX was its embarrassing boomerang boyfriend who kept coming back after every disastrous breakup. He first became Pope in 1032 when he was around 20, depending on which sources you trust. He got the job the way so many people did back then. His family pulled strings, pushed coins, and strong-armed everyone into agreement. The Tusculani family had held the papacy before and decided, why not install little Benedict next? Benedict didn't exactly have a sterling reputation. He was accused of bribery, simony, rampant nepotism, and just about every sin except being boring. Historians still argue whether he was evil or just laughably unqualified. But there's general consensus that he treated the papacy like a slot machine with a really nice hat. His first reign was chaotic. Rome grew tired of his antics. Locals rebelled. He fled the city. Then he came back. Then he left again. Eventually, it all became too much, even for him. So naturally, he did what anyone in his position might do. He sold the papacy. No, really. In 1045, Benedict IX literally sold the Holy See to his godfather, an archpriest named Giovanni Gratianus, who wanted to clean up the mess and try his hand at leading the church the respectable way. Gratianus became Pope Gregory VI, and you can almost hear him sighing as he stepped into the sandals. Meanwhile, Benedict pocketed the money and skipped town, reportedly to get married. That plan fell apart, of course. So what did he do next? Naturally, he came back. You can picture him at the papal gates, waving casually, like he just ran out for bread. Miss me? And incredibly, he managed to reclaim the throne, briefly, before being ousted again. Then, just for dramatic flair, he returned a third time, each comeback more farcical than the last. He was the Pope-mobile of papal comebacks. All in all, Benedict IX's reigns spanned over a decade, but with so many interruptions and scandals that chroniclers just gave up trying to count. If you're confused, don't worry. So was Rome. At one point, there were 3 competing popes, all laying claim to the title. The church wasn't just in crisis. It was in sitcom mode. And yet, for all his ridiculousness, Benedict XIX left a bizarre legacy. He highlighted just how fragile and corruptible the papacy had become. The Holy Office had turned into something that could be auctioned, abandoned, and reclaimed like a particularly cursed timeshare. You sit at the edge of a broken marble fountain, watching pigeons scatter from the ruined courtyard. Was this man a villain? A fool? A victim of the system? Maybe all 3. His story isn't just scandalous, it's illuminating. It shows a church struggling to define itself, wobbling between spiritual leadership and dynastic farce. One quirky tidbit that always gets overlooked. After all the chaos, Benedict IX was never officially excommunicated. He lived out his final years quietly, possibly even repenting. Some say he tried to reform his ways, retreating into silence. Others believe he was just exhausted. You try being Pope 3 times and not needing a nap. So now you know. The Church once had a Pope who who sold the job, walked away, then showed up again like he'd forgotten his keys. And the craziest part? That wasn't even the weirdest episode in papal history, because up ahead, past the gossip, past the bribes, past the scandalous feasts and feuding families, is something even more grotesque. Something so surreal, so unsettling, that it sounds like a Monty Python skit. A trial. A trial where the defendant was already dead. You shuffle quietly into a candle-lit chamber that smells of mildew and incense, your steps echoing off cold stone. At first, it looks like a normal medieval courtroom. Robed officials seated grimly, an audience of solemn clerics. But then your eyes adjust to the sight at the center. There, propped upright in a throne, is a corpse. Yes, an actual, literal, rotting corpse, dressed in papal robes with a tiara precariously perched on its half-collapsed skull. This is not the start of a horror story. This is the Cadaver Synod, and you're about to witness a dead man stand trial. The year is 897, and the Church has officially gone off the rails. Pope Stephen VI, a nervous and angry man with a serious grudge, decides it's not enough to criticize his predecessor. No, he wants to punish him. The target? Pope Formosus, who had died months earlier, been buried peacefully, and was presumably expecting an uneventful afterlife. Instead, Stephen has Formosus's corpse dug up, dressed in full regalia, and hauled into court like a guest of honor at the world's worst dinner party. 2 deacons are tasked with propping up the remains. One poor soul is designated to answer questions on the dead Pope's behalf. This is not a joke. It's not even exaggeration. This really happened. The charges are surreal. Violating canon law, coveting the papacy, switching dioceses without permission. The kind of stuff that would have been controversial if the defendant weren't visibly decomposing. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated political maneuver or just an act of unhinged rage. But either way, it turned the Vatican into a theater of the grotesque. You glance at the attending clergy. They look uncomfortable but silent, eyes darting to Stephen. No one dares object. The trial continues. Witnesses are called. Verdicts are read. And finally, the corpse is declared guilty. The punishment? Formosus's papal acts are annulled. His body is stripped of robes, the fingers used for blessing are cut off, and the rest of him is thrown in the Tiber River. This, according to Stephen, was justice. The rest of the world, however, just stared in horror. People were appalled. Rome descended into chaos. Riots broke out. And not long after the whole mess, Pope Stephen VI was himself imprisoned and then strangled in his cell. It's not exactly a Hollywood ending, but it's consistent with the general mood of, "Are you kidding me?" That defined the period. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just scandalous, it was symbolic. It revealed a church so tangled in politics, so consumed by grudges, that even death wasn't protection from vengeance. It also sparked decades of papal instability, as future popes tried to undo or defend the legacy of Formosus. And believe it or not, this wasn't the end of Formosus's posthumous journey. His body was recovered from the river by sympathetic monks, reburied, dug up again under a different pope, and eventually restored to its original resting place. Somewhere beneath layers of history lies what's left of a man who was pope, a defendant, a corpse, and a weird symbol of everything wrong with the medieval church, all in one life and afterlife. One fringe theory, often whispered, never confirmed, claims that the ghost of Formosus haunted the Lateran palace for decades afterward, turning crosses upside down and making books fall off shelves. It's probably not true, but let's be honest, you wouldn't blame him. As you sit and try to process the image of a courtroom filled with incense and rigor mortis, the absurdity begins to blur into something deeper. The church, for all its grandeur, was still human, flawed, petty, mortal. Its leaders could be brave or brilliant, or in this case, disturbingly theatrical. The Cadaver Synod has gone down in history as one of the most bizarre events in papal history, a literal trial of bones and grudges. But in the distance, something more subtle rises. Not a corpse, not a scandal, but a quiet change in scenery. Because soon, the popes won't even be in Rome at all. They're about to leave Italy entirely for a strange, wine-soaked exile in the south of France. You emerge from the gloom of the corpse trial, still trying to wipe the stench of formaldehyde and political bitterness from your cloak. Rome has grown weary. The streets buzz with more rats than pilgrims. The papal throne, once the seat of St. Peter, feels more like a cursed armchair that everyone wants, but no one knows how to sit in properly. So what does the Church do when Rome becomes unbearable? Simple. It leaves. Welcome to Avignon, France, a sleepy little town nestled along the Rhone River, known for its wine, sun-dappled hills, and soon, popes. Yes, the medieval papacy packed its bags, loaded up the cardinals, and headed to Provence for what would become a 70-year spiritual vacation, starting in 1309. The move was meant to be temporary, just a little papal getaway, while Rome sorted out its latest batch of riots, assassinations, and sewage issues. But like most temporary solutions in history, it stuck around longer than expected. Avignon became the new home of the papal court, and before long, it started looking less like a spiritual refuge and more like a deluxe ecclesiastical spa. You step through vine-covered gates into a new kind of Vatican. Here, the air is perfumed with lavender and intrigue. Cardinals lounge in silk robes, sipping local red, while casually negotiating bishoprics like they're trading playing cards. There are rumors of popes hoarding fine cheeses in private cellars. And the Palais des Papes, the towering Gothic palace that serves as papal HQ, is less holy sight and more Game of Thrones set piece with better wine. Why the move, really? Well, France had grown tremendously powerful under the Capetian kings, and they didn't exactly love the idea of a rogue Italian pope playing politics from Rome. So, under pressure from King Philip IV, Pope Clement V set up shop in Avignon. It was cozy, safe, and, most importantly, close enough for the French monarchy to peek in and suggest things now and then. The next few popes, all French, all selected under the glowing, watchful eyes of French royal influence. Historians still argue whether this was strategic pragmatism or outright political capture. Either way, the Church had effectively become France's +1. But Avignon wasn't just cozy. It was rich. The Church collected taxes from across Europe, and with no crumbling Roman infrastructure to drain the coffers, the popes funneled enormous wealth into their Provençal paradise. The palace was filled with art, feasts, elaborate ceremonies, and enough velvet to smother a monastery. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Italian factions called the Avignon popes puppets. Petrarch, the poet, called it the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, an exile not unlike the ancient Israelites. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but he had a point. The popes were living large while back in Rome. The churches crumbled, and mobs ruled the alleyways. One quirky footnote. In Avignon, the popes kept their own papal vineyard. Wine production boomed. Monks perfected grape cultivation techniques. You can still visit vineyards today that trace their origins to the Pope's wine cellars, proof that while sainthood was hit or miss, the wine was consistently divine. And yet, beneath the soft-lit luxury, pressure built. Calls for reform grew louder. People began to question whether the Church could truly lead Christendom while nestled in France like a pampered guest. Eventually, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI decided enough was enough. Spurred by Saint Catherine of Siena, a woman with more backbone than half the clergy combined, he returned the papacy to Rome. But like any group of people who've enjoyed too much wine and not enough accountability, the return wasn't smooth. In fact, the return led directly into something far worse. Not just one pope, not two, but three. So enjoy this calm while it lasts, because soon the Church is going to fracture, and every faction will claim to be right. It's a papal turf war, and it's going to make the Cadaver Synod look like a quiet misunderstanding over tea. The cobblestones beneath your feet feel cracked and uneven, as though even the ground itself is confused. The popes are back in Rome, yes, but something isn't right. Crowds murmur, cardinals argue in whispers, and somewhere in a cramped Vatican office, someone is scribbling, "We might have made a terrible mistake," in increasingly frantic Latin. Welcome to the Western Schism, one of the most bizarre chapters in papal history. This isn't just another scandal. This is administrative chaos on a holy level. A divine HR nightmare where there isn't one pope, or even two. But at one point, three men simultaneously claiming to be the real pope. It all starts innocently enough. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI dies shortly after returning to Rome from his Avignon retreat. The Roman people, sick of French influence, want an Italian pope, or at least someone who pronounces gnocchi properly. Under intense public pressure, and by pressure we mean angry mobs with pitchforks, the cardinals elect Urban VI, an Italian. Problem solved, right? Oh, no. Urban VI turns out to be, well, intense. He launches into furious reforms, berating the cardinals for corruption, calling them lazy. And generally, being the worst kind of micromanager. He once yelled at his cardinals for smiling too much. You get the sense he'd have made a great medieval gym coach, but maybe not a spiritual shepherd. The cardinals, mostly French, and very much not amused, decide they made the wrong call. So they do what any empowered ecclesiastical clique might. They declare Urban's election invalid, blaming mob pressure, flee to Avignon, and elect a new pope, Clement VII. Boom! Now there are two popes. Urban in Rome, Clement in Avignon. Both excommunicate each other. Both claim to be the true successor of St. Peter. And both have enough followers, armies, and snazzy robes to keep the show going. This isn't just a theological tiff. It's a full-blown ecclesiastical divorce. Europe splits down the middle. France, Scotland, and Spain side with Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stick with Rome. Even monasteries and universities are divided. You walk into a cathedral in Paris and hear one name during Mass. Travel to Venice the next day, and they're blessing someone entirely different. And it only gets messier. When both original popes die, their factions elect new successors, who carry on the feud with fresh outrage and even fancier hats. No one wants to blink. No one wants to admit they backed the wrong holy horse. By 1409, the Church tries to fix things. A big council is held in Pisa, where theologians gather to heal the schism. Their solution? Depose both popes and elect a third one, Alexander V. Now, there are 3 popes. You take a moment, rub your temples, maybe get a glass of water, because the medieval papacy has now officially become a religious reality show. 3 men, 3 papal courts, 3 bureaucracies, seal stamps, armies, and factions. It's a miracle anything got signed, let alone canonized. The joke going around Europe? Who's the Pope this week? No one's sure whether to pray, laugh, or start a new church altogether. Finally, in 1417, after nearly 4 decades of this ridiculous spiritual triangle, the Council of Constance manages to do what no angry mob or scheming cardinal could: bring the madness to an end. They deposed or accepted resignations from all rival popes and elected Martin V, a compromise candidate everyone could live with. Mostly. Probably. And like that, the papacy was unified again. Bruised, embarrassed, but still standing. Historians still argue whether the schism permanently damaged the Church's authority, or whether it was just one more hiccup in a long, hiccup-filled history. But one thing is certain. For decades, ordinary Christians didn't know which pope to follow. Who held the keys to heaven? Who was just a very confident fraud in a fancy chair? And through it all, you can almost hear the whisper of weary monks scribbling it all down. And then there were 3 popes. And honestly, we're just trying our best. As the dust settles and the papal throne begins to creak back into a single seat, you'd think the scandals are done. But no, because just around the corner, strolling into the Renaissance in embroidered slippers, is a new kind of pope. A man with political ambition, a flair for the dramatic, and some rather scandalous children. It's time to meet the Borgias. The air in Rome feels different now. The swords have been sheathed. The worst of the schism is over, and yet the atmosphere is thick, not with incense, but with perfume. The Renaissance is blooming across Europe, and the Vatican is about to get a full makeover. Less sackcloth and ashes, more velvet, oil paintings, and strategic marriages. And at the heart of it all, a family name whispered with either admiration or pure dread. Borgia. You step carefully into a marble corridor lined with golden sconces and guards in polished armor. This isn't the chaotic squabbling of papal factions anymore. This is something sleek, deliberate, and dangerous. And sitting at the center of it is Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal who in 1492 becomes Pope Alexander VI, the final boss of scandalous popes. His election, let's just say, it wasn't exactly driven by divine revelation. Rodrigo allegedly bribed half the College of Cardinals with mountains of gold, exotic gifts, and the occasional promise of high-ranking jobs for nephews no one had ever heard of. Historians still argue whether his vote buying was the worst ever or just the best documented. Still, the man had charisma, intelligence, a knack for politics, and zero interest in pretending to be humble. You can almost see him now, broad smile, rings glinting in the candlelight, absolutely certain the papacy is both a spiritual mission and a killer networking opportunity. Pope Alexander VI wastes no time. His children, yes, children, move into the Vatican almost immediately. You meet Cesare Borgia, his ambitious and ruthless son, and Lucrezia Borgia, his enigmatic daughter, known for her beauty, her rumored poison rings, and her unfortunate track record with husbands. For a supposed celibate pope, Alexander had a remarkably large and visible family, and he made no effort to hide them. One quirky detail: he hosted massive banquets inside the Vatican, meals so extravagant they made Roman emperors blush. One famous, and very likely embellished, event was the Banquet of Chestnuts, where the floors were reportedly strewn with, you guessed it, chestnuts and dancers and other items not typically found in your standard church picnic. Contemporary sources claimed cardinals were invited to indulge generously. It's the kind of scene that has scholars carefully footnoting, possibly exaggerated, while trying not to burst into flames. Alexander VI's papacy was also marked by fierce nepotism. He made his son Cesare a cardinal at age 18, then later helped him switch careers to full-time warlord. Yes, Cesare was the spiritual successor to Judas and the military prototype for Machiavelli's The Prince. You know you're shady when Renaissance authors start writing leadership manuals about how clever your betrayals were. Meanwhile, Lucrezia was married off 3 times for political gain, each union more suspiciously timed than the last. One husband was murdered. Another mysteriously vanished. The third stuck around, which historians have generally taken as a minor miracle. And yet, for all this scandal, Alexander VI was effective. Ruthless, yes. Morally flexible, absolutely. But he consolidated church power, balanced Italian politics like a chessboard, and didn't flinch even when entire cities turned against him. He was a pope who thought big, schemed bigger, and genuinely believed that securing his family's future was not only justified, it was holy. Still, karma catches up. Rome becomes uneasy. The Borgia name starts to curdle in public sentiment. Enemies gather. In 1503, Alexander VI dies suddenly, possibly from malaria, possibly poisoned. Historians still argue whether he drank from the wrong cup or simply lost a duel with a mosquito. After his death, the Vatican scrambles to erase some of the more colorful parts of his reign. Cesare's enemies close in. Lucrezia is shuffled off to Ferrara, where she becomes, oddly enough, a respected duchess. The Borgia flame fizzles, but never fully goes out. Even now, centuries later, their name pulses through history like a drum beat. synonymous with corruption, intrigue, seduction, and yet also with vision, intelligence, and a twisted kind of brilliance. You sit now in a quiet Vatican chapel, the marble cool beneath you. The candlelight flickers. The scandals of the Middle Ages, once loud and brazen, now feel like fading echoes. You've seen popes gamble, fight, flee, return, and even argue with corpses. But through it all, the Church endured, bent, but never fully broken. And as the final echoes of Borgia decadence fade into silence, you feel the tempo of the story slowing. The flickering fire of scandal dims. The drama gives way to stillness. It's time to wind down, to let your eyes drift gently shut, even as whispers of ancient sins dance quietly through the candle smoke. The marble is cool beneath your fingertips now. The candle flames sway slower. Even the air seems to hold its breath as we ease into the final chamber of this strange, scandal-soaked journey. You've walked through corridors echoing with betrayal, smelled the incense mixed with wine, and stood witness to trials where the defendant was already decomposing. But now, everything softens. You're still in the Vatican, but it's different tonight. The scandals have settled like dust on forgotten scrolls. The voices that once bellowed excommunications and clinked goblets in secret have grown faint. Only the steady, sleepy rhythm of dripping wax and rustling tapestries remains. For centuries, the papacy continued, bent beneath the weight of sin and ambition, yes, but never shattered. Each pope, each era, added its own shade to the mosaic, some noble, others disastrous, and a few so absurd they feel more like parables than history. And yet, through it all, the structure held, somehow, like a storm-weathered cathedral, cracked, but standing. You think back to Pope Joan, perhaps, a woman, a myth, or maybe a buried truth. To John XII and his dice. To Benedict XIX, selling the throne like a summer internship. The corpse of Formosus. The exile to Avignon. The threefold papal tug-of-war. And the Borgia court, more opera than church, with velvet-draped ambition hiding behind golden crosses. Each moment seemed like it might break everything. And maybe it did. A little. But the real scandal, perhaps, was that it kept going. that people still prayed, still knelt, still looked to Rome for something sacred, even when the sanctity was wearing silk slippers and handing out bishoprics like party favors. Even the most outrageous popes sat on the same throne as saints and martyrs. That tension, that impossibility, is what makes history so human and so hypnotic. You let the last names drift from your memory like incense. The candles grow lower. The marble floor hums quietly underfoot, like it remembers everything, but has learned to keep secrets. Outside, the wind moves gently through the pines of the Vatican gardens. Inside, the past curls up in the shadows, content to rest for now. No more trials, no more feasts, no more rival popes or questionable nephews. Just silence. You lie back now. The flicker of scandal becomes a flicker of candlelight. The names blur. The robes dissolve. The sins settle like snow. And finally, the only voice left is your breath, slow, steady, fading.